It had been 3,000 years since the Earth was destroyed. Once, it was a place of beauty, life, and thriving civilizations. The cities were filled with the sounds of people living, laughing, working, and dreaming of a future. But all of that had vanished in an instant. The skies, once clear and bright, had turned dark and heavy. The lush forests and fields were burned to ashes. The oceans, once teeming with life, were now silent and still. The destruction had come quickly, a violent force from the unknown, sweeping across the planet. The survivors were few, and they had been forced to hide, to wait for the day when they might return to reclaim the world that had once been theirs. The silence of the earth had endured for centuries. No one knew what had happened to the invaders, the beings who had destroyed humanity, leaving nothing behind but ruins. The survivors lived in scattered, hidden places, surviving in the shadows, forgotten by time. But something had changed. A spark of hope had been lit, and for the first time in millennia, a signal had been sent. The humans were coming back. In the depths of space, far from the Earth they once called home, a fleet of ships was making its way toward the planet. The spacecrafts moved silently through the cold void, their engines humming with the energy of a long-forgotten dream. The survivors, now called the Avengers, had been waiting for this moment for generations. They were the last hope of humanity, and they carried with them not only the knowledge of the past, but also the deep, burning desire for revenge. The alien invaders had taken everything from them: family, friends, homes, and now it was time to take it all back. As the fleet approached the Earth, the survivors looked out from their ship's windows. They could see the planet in the distance, a blue and green world that seemed to call out to them. But it was not the world they remembered. The once vibrant planet was now a shadow of its former self, covered in scars and wreckage. Huge craters marked the surface, and strange, twisted creatures roamed the land. The Earth's atmosphere had been altered, and the very air was thick with a sense of danger. It was a world that had been ravaged by an unknown enemy. And now, the people who had once called it home were returning to reclaim it. Among the survivors was a young soldier named Kian. He had grown up hearing stories of the Earth before the invasion. His parents had been among the last to survive, hiding in the deep caves beneath the planet's surface. They had taught him how to fight, how to survive, and most importantly, how to never forget the past. Kian had trained his entire life for this moment, to step onto the Earth once again, to face the enemy that had destroyed everything. But as the ship drew closer to the planet, a deep unease settled in his chest. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was finally here, he felt an overwhelming sense of fear. He wasn't afraid of the enemy, though. He was afraid of what he might find when they landed. What if the Earth was no longer a place worth saving? What if it had been too damaged, too changed, for humanity to ever return to it? Kian shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. He had a job to do, a mission to complete. The time for doubt was over. He would find the invaders, and he would make them pay for what they had done. The ship's captain, a strong-willed woman named Arya, stood at the front of the command room, her eyes focused on the screen showing the Earth in the distance. Her expression was hard, determined. She had led many battles in her life, but this one was different. This wasn't just about fighting an enemy. This was about avenging a lost world, a world that had once been her home. She had lost everything when the invaders came: her family, her friends, her entire way of life. And now, after all these years, she was finally getting the chance to bring the fight to them. "We're almost there," Arya said, her voice steady, but tinged with the weight of everything they had been through. "Prepare for landing. This is our chance. We take back what's ours, or we die trying." The crew, silent but resolute, nodded in agreement. Kian, standing near the back, couldn't help but feel a strange sense of dread. He wasn't sure why, but something about the situation felt wrong. The Earth they were about to land on was not the same world that his ancestors had left behind. There was no hope that they would return to a paradise, no guarantee that they would find anything worth saving. He knew the mission was important, but part of him wondered if they were chasing a dream, a memory of something that no longer existed. As the ship began its descent, the view of the Earth grew clearer. The dark clouds swirling above the surface seemed to reach out toward them like the fingers of some monstrous creature. The landscape below was broken, torn apart by the years of destruction. But amidst the devastation, Kyan could make out signs of life. Strange, twisted forms moved through the ruins. These were not humans. They were the alien invaders, the ones who had torn the planet apart. The thought of facing them made Kyan's heart race, but he quickly pushed the fear aside. He was ready. The ship touched down on the Earth's surface with a soft jolt. The doors opened, and the survivors stepped out, their boots sinking into the soft, ashen soil. The air smelled strange, thick with the scent of decay. Kyan pulled his hood up over his head and tightened his grip on his weapon. His senses were on high alert, every muscle in his body tense. The landscape before them was vast and silent, a wasteland. There was no sign of the enemy, but Kyan knew they were out there. He could feel their presence, like a shadow hovering over them, waiting. Arya motioned for the group to stay close, leading them through the ruins of what had once been a bustling city. The buildings were now nothing more than skeletal remains, twisted metal, and shattered glass. It was hard to imagine that this had been a place of life, a place of memories. The survivors moved cautiously, their eyes darting around, watching for any sign of the enemy. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. There was no sound of birds, no breeze rustling through the trees. It was as if the planet itself had died along with the people who had once lived here. Kyan felt a pang of sadness deep in his chest. He had never known this Earth, but standing here, amidst the ruins, he couldn't help but feel the loss. The world they had fought for had slipped through their fingers, and now all that was left was this barren wasteland. It was then that they heard it, a distant noise, barely audible at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of something massive moving through the wreckage. The survivors froze, their eyes widening. Kyan's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, but hearing it, feeling it in the pit of his stomach, was something else entirely. The invaders were here, and the fight for Earth had just begun. The ground beneath their feet trembled as the sound grew louder, echoing through the ruins of the city. Kyan's heart raced as his hand instinctively tightened around the weapon at his side. His senses screamed at him to move, to run, but his training held him in place. The survivors behind him were just as still, waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves. The air was thick with tension as each footstep seemed to grow louder, more pronounced, like a heartbeat signaling the arrival of something dangerous, something they had come here to confront. In the distance, the shadows shifted. At first, Kyan thought it was just a trick of the light, a distortion from the dim atmosphere. But then he saw them, figures moving swiftly between the wreckage. The invaders. Their tall, alien frames were cloaked in dark armor, blending into the destroyed landscape. They moved with unsettling precision, as though they had been waiting for this moment, anticipating the arrival of the survivors. Kyan's breath hitched. He had only heard stories about the invaders, their cold, emotionless faces, their ability to destroy entire cities with a single command. But seeing them in person was far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. These were not just enemies. They were the force that had erased his people, his history. He felt a deep, gut-wrenching anger rise within him. The memories of his ancestors, their lives, their laughter, their homes, flashed through his mind, and he knew that this moment, this confrontation, was personal. The leader of the invaders appeared from the shadows, towering above the rest of his army. His alien features were sharp and angular, his eyes glowing with a cold, calculating intelligence. His armor reflected the faint light, giving him an almost otherworldly appearance. There was no mistaking who he was. This was the one who had ordered the destruction of Earth, the one responsible for the downfall of humanity. Kian's hands clenched into fists, his jaw set. This was the one he had come to kill. Arya, standing at the front of the group, raised a hand to signal for everyone to hold their positions. Her eyes never left the invader leader, her face a mask of determination. She had been a commander in the war, and she knew how to read the enemy. She could sense the tension in the air, the hesitation in her own people. But this was no time for fear. They had come to avenge their world, and they wouldn't back down now. "Stay close," Arya said, her voice low but steady. "We're not here to die today. We're here to make them remember who we are." The survivors nodded in unison, readying their weapons, their faces set in grim resolve. Kian's eyes flicked back to the alien leader, his grip on his weapon tightening. He had been prepared for this moment, but now, as the confrontation became real, he felt the weight of everything that had led them here. He wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for the future of his people, for those who had been lost, for the earth that had been stolen from them. The invader leader took a step forward, his voice a deep, eerie growl that echoed through the ruins. "You think you can defeat us? You think you can take back what is ours?" His words were cold, dismissive, as though he didn't even see the survivors as a real threat. But Kian could see the flicker of something in the alien's eyes, a hint of doubt, a trace of uncertainty. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The invaders weren't as invincible as they had once appeared. Kian's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. They had come to Earth not only to fight but to reclaim their home, to take back what was rightfully theirs. It wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about survival. About proving that humanity could never be wiped out so easily. Without warning, the alien leader raised his hand, and his army sprang into action. The ground shook as their weapons powered up, sending waves of energy pulsing through the air. Kian barely had time to react as the first blast of fire zipped past him, narrowly missing his shoulder. His instincts kicked in, and he dove to the ground, rolling into cover behind a crumbled building. The others followed suit, weapons drawn, returning fire as the alien forces advanced with terrifying speed and precision. The battle erupted in chaos. Explosions rocked the ground, sending debris flying in every direction. The survivors fought with everything they had, each of them determined to avenge the fallen and protect what little remained of their world. Kian fired his weapon, the sound of each shot ringing out like thunder in the stillness of the ruined city. He moved quickly, using the wreckage for cover, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness in the invaders' formation. But despite their best efforts, the invaders were overwhelming. Their technology was far superior, and their soldiers seemed to be everywhere, as though they were part of the very landscape itself. Kian could hear the shouts of his comrades, the cries of pain, and the sound of battle all around him. It was like a nightmare come to life. Arya's voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. "Fall back. We need to regroup." Kian's heart sank. They weren't winning. Not yet, anyway. The invaders were too strong, and they were everywhere. But there was something in Arya's tone, something that made Kian believe that all hope wasn't lost. She had been through battles before, fought battles that seemed impossible to win. She wouldn't give up now. He scanned the battlefield again, trying to make sense of the situation. Then his eyes locked onto something he had missed earlier, a weakness in the alien leader's position. There was a gap in their defense, a small opening that, if exploited, could turn the tide of the battle. Without thinking, Kian sprang into action, moving quickly and quietly toward the alien leader's position. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, but there was no turning back now. He dodged blasts of energy, narrowly avoiding the deadly rays as he made his way closer to the leader. His comrades were still fighting, but Kian knew they needed him to do something more. He had to act fast. The enemy leader couldn't be allowed to remain unharmed. He had to make them feel fear. Just as he was about to strike, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his side. One of the invaders had spotted him, and a burst of energy hit him square in the chest. He staggered, his breath leaving his body in a rush. But he didn't stop. Grabbing hold of the nearest piece of debris, Kan pulled himself up, determined to finish what he had started. In that moment, as the alien leader turned to face him, Kan knew this was no longer just about revenge. This was about humanity's future, and he would give everything he had to ensure that Earth's story didn't end in defeat. The battle was far from over, but Kian was ready for whatever came next. The battle had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. The once quiet and eerie silence of the destroyed Earth was now filled with the deafening sounds of explosions, blaster fire, and the desperate cries of combat. Kian's heart thudded in his chest as he took cover behind a shattered piece of concrete. His breath came in short bursts, and the sharp pain in his side made it difficult to focus. But there was no time to stop, no time to dwell on the injury. The fight was far from over. Kan peeked around the corner, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The alien forces were relentless, pushing forward with every step. Their dark armor seemed impervious to the energy blasts that the humans fired at them. Each movement they made was calculated, as if they were playing a game, one where the humans had already lost. Kian clenched his fists, the anger inside him rising with every second. He had seen his comrades fall, their bodies collapsing under the invaders' fire, and each loss made the fire of revenge burn deeper in his heart. He couldn't let it end like this. Behind him, Aria's voice rang out again, cutting through the noise of the battlefield. "We need to make a push. If we stay on the defensive, we'll be wiped out. We have to take down their leader." Kian's eyes narrowed. He had been trying to reach the alien leader, the one responsible for the destruction of Earth, but every step he took was met with resistance. The invaders seemed to anticipate their every move, as if they could read their minds. They were smarter than they had first thought. It was no longer just a matter of strength, it was about strategy, and the aliens had the upper hand. But Kian refused to back down. He knew what was at stake. If they didn't defeat the leader, they would never win. They had come all this way through space, through time, and across a shattered world, only to fail now. That wasn't an option. Kian pushed himself up from his crouch and sprinted toward the next piece of cover, ducking low as another energy blast scorched the ground just behind him. His thoughts were a blur of rage and determination. He had lost so much. Earth had been stolen from him. Now it was time to take it back. His eyes searched the battlefield for the alien leader. Through the chaos, Kian finally saw him, standing at the center of the alien forces, commanding them with an eerie calmness. The leader's tall, intimidating figure stood out among the others. His cold, glowing eyes scanned the battlefield with ruthless efficiency. Kian's pulse quickened. This was the moment. He could feel it. Without thinking, he charged forward, ignoring the shots that whizzed past him. His heart was pounding in his ears, his adrenaline kicking in. He had one chance. He couldn't hesitate. He wouldn't let the Earth fall again. But just as he was about to close the distance between himself and the leader, something unexpected happened. A blast of energy hit the ground just ahead of him, sending him sprawling backward. The force of the explosion knocked him off his feet, and he landed hard against the broken concrete. Pain shot through his body, and for a moment, everything went black. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, and gasped for air. His head was spinning, and the world around him felt like it was closing in. He could hear the sounds of the battle raging on, but everything felt distant. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had they known? How had the invaders predicted his move? It was as if they were always one step ahead. Kan struggled to his feet, his body protesting the movement. The pain in his side was unbearable, but he gritted his teeth and ignored it. He couldn't afford to stop now. He couldn't afford to lose. The Earth depended on him, and the survivors depended on him. Through the haze of the battlefield, Kian saw Aria, rallying the troops. Her commanding presence cut through the chaos like a beacon, and he felt a spark of hope. She was still fighting. They all were. Taking a deep breath, Kian forced himself to focus. The alien leader was still there, still commanding his forces. But there was something in his posture, something in the way he stood, that made Kian realize something important. The leader wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. He had a weakness. He was relying too heavily on his army. His attention was divided. Kian looked around, spotting a small group of survivors moving toward a position near the leader. They were going to try again. They had to. The aliens were strong, but they were not invincible. If they could catch the leader off guard, if they could hit him when he wasn't expecting it, they might have a chance. Kian nodded to himself, making up his mind. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. He wasn't going to let the memories of the past cloud his vision. He had to keep moving forward. He had to be the one to strike the final blow. The survivors were already moving, pushing forward toward the alien leader. Kian followed them, his legs heavy with the weight of exhaustion and pain. But his resolve was stronger than ever. Each step brought him closer to his goal, closer to the moment where the invaders would finally know what it meant to face humanity's fury. As he neared the leader's position, the air seemed to grow colder. The alien forces were beginning to notice the survivors' movement, shifting their attention to block their path. Kian's eyes locked onto the leader, who was now fully aware of the human attack. The leader's face remained stoic, emotionless. But Kian could see it now, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The invader wasn't as certain of his victory as he had been before. He knew that humanity was more dangerous than he had imagined. With a surge of strength, Kian pushed forward, his comrades at his side. The sound of blaster fire filled the air once again as they fought their way through the alien forces. Kian's eyes were locked on the leader, who was now trying to retreat, realizing that his army couldn't protect him from the humans' fury. Kian reached the alien leader just as he was turning to flee. With all the strength he could muster, Kian lunged forward, tackling the leader to the ground. The invader struggled beneath him, but Kian held firm, his fingers wrapped around the alien's throat. For the first time in 3,000 years, humanity had the upper hand. "Earth is ours," Kian growled through gritted teeth, his voice low and filled with pure emotion. With one final, crushing blow, Kian ended the alien leader's life. The battle around them seemed to stop in that moment. The invaders faltered, their once unified army now breaking apart without their leader's guidance. The humans, fueled by their loss and their rage, fought harder, pushing the invaders back. The tide was turning. Kian stood over the fallen leader, breathing heavily, his body battered and bruised. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something else. Hope. Earth could be reclaimed. Humanity could rebuild. As the last of the alien forces retreated, the survivors gathered around Kian, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and awe. They had done it. They had defeated the invaders. They had avenged their fallen world. But as Kian looked out at the ruined Earth, he knew that the battle for their home wasn't over. It had only just begun. The battle was far from over. Even as the last of the invaders retreated, their leader's death hadn't marked the end of the war. It had merely shifted the tide. Kian stood amidst the ruins of the city, his breath ragged, his body battered, and his mind a whirlwind of emotions. They had won this skirmish, but the cost was high. There were still many unanswered questions, many dangers waiting in the shadows. The Earth was not yet free. Around him, the survivors were regrouping, tending to the wounded, and assessing the damage. Arya moved toward him, her face set with the same determination that had driven her for years. Despite her calm demeanor, there was a subtle flicker in her eyes. She had seen too much loss, too much destruction, to be easily fooled by their small victory. Kian met her gaze, still holding the weapon he had used to bring down the invader leader. It felt heavy in his hand, as though the weight of everything they had endured, everything they had lost, was now pressing against him all at once. He lowered the weapon but didn't let go of it. It was a symbol of humanity's resilience, of their fight for survival. But it was also a reminder that there was still so much left to do. "We've won this battle," Arya said, her voice steady. "But we haven't won the war. This was just the first step." Kian nodded, though part of him still couldn't believe it. They had taken down the leader, the one who had orchestrated the destruction of Earth. But he knew, deep down, that the forces that had destroyed their world were far from gone. This was only the beginning of their true mission. "We need to regroup," Arya continued. "There's still a remnant of their forces out there, and we need to track them down before they can organize another attack." Kian glanced around, his gaze sweeping over the survivors. They were still reeling from the fight. Some were sitting, catching their breath, while others worked quickly to tend to the injured. The city, what was left of it, was eerily silent now, the aftermath of the battle leaving an almost haunting stillness behind. The ground was scorched, the air thick with the smell of smoke and decay. It was a stark reminder of what they were fighting for, and how much they had already lost. Kian's mind raced, his thoughts tangled with memories of Earth before the invasion. He had never known it in its prime, but he had heard stories from those who had lived it. His parents, his grandparents, each one had told him of a world filled with vibrant cities, green forests, and oceans teeming with life. All of that was gone now, and he wondered if they could ever bring it back, or if the Earth would forever remain a barren, broken shell of what it once was. "What's next?" Kian asked quietly, his voice hoarse from the battle, and the emotions swirling within him. Arya's expression softened for a moment, though the hardness in her eyes never wavered. "Next, we make sure this never happens again. We rebuild. We fight for every inch of this planet, every life that remains. And we send a message to anyone who dares to take this world from us again. Humanity will not be defeated." Her words were simple, but they were powerful. Kian could feel the strength in them, the unbreakable resolve that had carried her. And all of them, this far. The fight was far from over, but Arya's determination was like a beacon, a light in the darkness of their shattered world. "We can't do this alone," Kian said, his voice gaining strength. "We need to find the others. There are more of us out there, survivors who've been hiding. We need to unite, to become stronger." Arya nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mix of pride and understanding. "You're right. There are still pockets of humanity out there. We'll need to find them. And when we do, we bring them together. We show them that the fight isn't over. The Earth belongs to us, and we will reclaim it." Kian felt a surge of hope. For the first time, he felt like there was a real chance to rebuild, to see Earth return to something resembling what it once was. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more enemies to face. But in that moment, he realized that they had the strength to survive. They had the will to keep fighting. As they moved out, Kian stayed close to Arya and the others. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they knew their path. The invaders were not gone, and they would have to face more enemies in the future. But now they had something the invaders didn't: unity. They had the drive to fight for their world, their people, and their future. The survivors pressed forward, their mission clear. They were no longer just a scattered group of survivors. They were a force united in their goal. Together, they would find the last remnants of the invader army, hunt them down, and make sure that Earth would never again fall into the hands of their destroyers. As the team moved through the ruined city, Kian couldn't help but glance back at the wreckage. He had a deep, unshakable feeling that the Earth, though scared and broken, could still be healed. It would take time, it would take sacrifice, but humanity would rise again. The journey was just beginning. They would rebuild, they would fight, and they would take back their world. With every step, Kian could feel it: humanity's will to survive. The Earth was not done yet, and neither were they. The winds howled through the ruined city, carrying with them the echoes of destruction. But now, those echoes were replaced by something new, a sense of determination, a sense of purpose. Kian stood at the edge of a broken street, gazing out at the desolate landscape. He had seen the earth ravaged by the invaders, the once vibrant world reduced to a barren wasteland. But something inside him had shifted. He knew they couldn't afford to look back anymore. The only way forward was to keep fighting, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Beside him, Arya surveyed the surroundings, her face a mask of calm intensity. It was clear she was already thinking several steps ahead. The battle they had won was not the final victory, and she understood the fragility of their momentary triumph. The invaders were still out there, scattered across the planet, licking their wounds, no doubt preparing for their next move. They couldn't rest. Not yet. Kian turned toward her, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We can't keep moving aimlessly. We need a plan. We need to bring together the remaining survivors. We need to know where they are. Arya nodded slowly, her sharp eyes reflecting the same fire that burned inside him. We will. We need to make contact with every group we can find, every settlement. But there's something more we need to do. We need to learn more about the invaders, their command structure, their technology, everything. We can't just keep fighting blindly. Kian agreed. While their victory had been a massive blow to the invaders, it hadn't broken them. It was clear now that there were factions within the alien forces, each operating independently in different regions of the Earth. Their leader had fallen, but their military might was still formidable. A simple counterattack could undo everything they had achieved. They had to be smarter. They had to be prepared. After a brief moment of contemplation, Arya continued, I know of an old military outpost just north of here. It used to be a stronghold before the invasion. It's a risk, but if the invaders haven't completely overrun it, there may be intel we can use. Kian's mind raced. It was the perfect opportunity to gather information, to get a clearer picture of the enemy's plans. If the outpost still had functioning equipment, they could use it to communicate with other survivor groups and track the remaining invaders. But the risk was great. The invaders were no longer an unknown force. They knew they were being hunted, and Kian feared that every move they made would be watched. I'll go, Kian said, his voice firm. I'll find out what's left. But I need a small team, just enough to get in and out without attracting attention. Arya considered his words for a moment before nodding. I'll send a few with you, but remember, we're not just gathering information. We need to find out if there's a bigger operation still going on, whether they plan to retaliate or regroup. This could be our chance to strike first. The plan was set. A small team would travel to the old military outpost, scavenging whatever they could from the ruins of civilization along the way. Every step they took would be fraught with danger. The invaders had left their mark on every corner of the planet, and there was no guarantee the outpost hadn't fallen into enemy hands. As Kian prepared for the journey, he couldn't help but think back to the past, to the Earth that had been before the invaders' arrival. He could almost feel it, before everything had changed. But he pushed those thoughts aside. The Earth they had once known was gone. The new world was one they would have to forge, and it would not be easy. His heart heavy but resolved, Kian looked over his team. A small group of survivors, all hardened by the brutal reality of the invasion. There was Leela, a sharpshooter who had lost everything to the invaders, and Jackson, a former engineer who had been crucial in helping them salvage technology. Alongside them were several others, each with their own expertise and their own reasons for joining the mission. Together, they were a small but strong force, and they had one goal: to uncover the secrets of the invaders and ensure humanity's survival. The journey ahead would not be easy. The land was full of dangers, both from the invaders and from the harsh environment. Cities like the one they had just left were almost completely abandoned, their inhabitants either wiped out or scattered into hiding. The wilderness, once lush and teeming with life, was now a shadow of itself, decimated by the invaders' destructive presence. The roads were ruined, and every abandoned building felt like a trap waiting to spring. But Kian was determined. He would do whatever it took. The Earth was theirs, and no one, not even the invaders, could take that away. As they left the city behind, the team moved through the ruins with practiced silence, eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. They had learned to be cautious, to be vigilant. The invaders were always one step ahead, but they had the advantage of knowing their home. They had the advantage of surviving the worst humanity had faced. Hours passed, and the city skyline was soon replaced by the open, desolate plains. Kian kept his gaze forward, his thoughts focused on the mission ahead. They had to find that outpost. They had to uncover everything the invaders knew about their plans. At dusk, they made camp in a hollowed-out structure, its walls now nothing more than skeletons of what had once been. The fire they built was small, hidden from sight, but even so, Kian couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with the weight of past destruction, and every creak of metal or crack of stone made him jump. They had become used to the silence, but now, that silence was broken by every rustle and snap. "We move out at first light," Kian said softly, looking at each of his teammates. "Stay sharp." As the team settled in for the night, Kian couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. There was something about the invaders, something deeper than just their technology, their ruthlessness. They weren't just invaders. They had a purpose, a mission that went beyond conquest. They were a force driven by something darker, something that Kian couldn't fully comprehend yet. Tomorrow, they would learn more. Tomorrow, they would make their move. And Kian, more than anyone, understood one thing. This was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the wasteland. The air was still, heavy with the remnants of the previous night's storm. Kian awoke to the sound of the wind whispering through the shattered buildings around them. The fire they had carefully built was reduced to a pile of smoldering embers, and his team had already started packing up their gear. The weight of the journey ahead hung in the air, each member of the group already mentally preparing for what was to come. Kian stood, stretching his aching muscles. The remnants of his injuries still ached, but they were nothing compared to the feeling of urgency pressing at him. They had a mission. There was no time to waste. "Ready?" Aria's voice came from behind him, and he turned to find her watching him, her expression unreadable. She had always been a steady force, someone who could keep a clear head no matter the chaos. But Kian could see the strain in her eyes now. They all felt it, the weight of the past, the uncertainty of the future. "We move now," Kian replied, his voice firm. The plan was simple. Head for the outpost, locate any remaining tech or intel, and return before the invaders could regroup. Time was of the essence. The longer they waited, the more the invaders would prepare, and they couldn't afford to let them regroup. The team set off, the sky above them growing brighter as the sun rose higher. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows of ruined buildings, staying off the main roads to avoid detection. The wasteland was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel beneath their boots and the occasional distant rumble of falling debris from a collapsed structure. Kian kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the landscape, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. They weren't alone. He could feel it. As they approached the military outpost, the silence of the world around them seemed to grow deeper, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The structure loomed ahead, a crumbling relic from a time before the invasion. What had once been a stronghold now appeared to be little more than a hollow shell, the walls cracked and battered, the gate hanging open, like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Kian's pulse quickened as they reached the outskirts of the outpost. He exchanged glances with Leela, Jackson, and the others, and they all nodded in silent understanding. Every step forward brought them closer to answers and to danger. The outpost was eerily still. No guards, no movement. It almost felt like a trap. Kian motioned for the group to move closer, signaling for them to spread out and take cover. His instincts were on high alert. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. "Stay low," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible. "If this is a trap, we don't want to be caught in the open." Kian crouched, his eyes scanning every corner of the outpost. It looked abandoned, but something felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was as though the very walls of the outpost were watching them. They approached the entrance cautiously, weapons raised. Jackson moved to the side, his engineering skills making him the best choice to examine any security systems that might still be active. As he worked, Kian kept an eye on the surroundings, his mind racing with possibilities. Was the outpost really empty, or had the invaders left a few surprises behind? After what felt like an eternity, Jackson gave a small nod, signaling that the door was open. He had disabled the last of the security systems. The group moved quickly, slipping inside the darkened building. Inside, the outpost was a maze of corridors, metal walls lined with old equipment, and faded posters from a time before the invasion. The air was thick with dust, the once pristine white walls now stained and cracked. Kian's footsteps echoed through the empty halls, amplifying the sense of isolation. It felt like they were walking through the ruins of a forgotten world, a place left behind by those who had once called it home. They moved deeper into the facility, their eyes darting around every corner, looking for any signs of life, or signs of the enemy. Every room they passed seemed to tell a story of the past, from the abandoned barracks to the decaying command center. But it was the final room that caught Kian's attention. A door at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar. Inside, a faint green glow leaked from the cracks, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Kian exchanged a look with Arya, and she nodded. It was time to find out what was hidden behind that door. They approached cautiously, weapons raised. Kian pushed the door open slowly, his heart racing in his chest. The room was large, filled with rows of strange machines, some of which Kian had never seen before. But what caught his attention wasn't the machines themselves. It was the holographic display in the center of the room, flickering to life as they entered. A map of the Earth appeared in the air, and Kian's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a map of Earth. It was a map of invasion sites, each marked with glowing red dots, indicating areas the invaders had already taken or were planning to take next. The map stretched across continents, each region showing different levels of invasion progress. Some areas were nearly wiped clean of life, while others were still in the process of being assimilated. Kian's fingers hovered over the glowing map, his mind racing as he processed the information. The invaders weren't just attacking random cities. They were methodical, strategic. They were systematically eliminating humanity, one stronghold at a time. And the worst part was that they had already established footholds in places Kian never imagined. Areas that had once been untouched. "We need to destroy this," Layla said, her voice cold with determination as she stepped forward. She had been silent until now, but Kian could see the anger in her eyes. It was the same anger they all felt. The invaders had taken everything from them, and now they were getting a clearer picture of just how far their reach extended. But Kian shook his head. "No, we need this information. We can't destroy it. We need to know where they're going next." He was right. They couldn't afford to let the invaders have the upper hand. They had to use this data to their advantage, to predict the next move, and make sure they were ready. As they continued to study the map, the sudden sound of movement from behind them froze them in place. Kian's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the door. They hadn't been alone after all. A group of invaders stepped into the room, their armored figures towering in the doorway, weapons raised and ready. The map of the Earth still flickered in the air, illuminating the invaders' cold, emotionless faces. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Kian's mind raced. They were surrounded. They had walked right into the heart of the enemy's lair. But there was no time for hesitation, no time for fear. This was the moment they had been preparing for. They weren't going to run. Not now. The battle for Earth was far from over. And this time, humanity was ready. The room was filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of the holographic map still glowing in the center of the room. The invaders stood like statues in the doorway, their dark, alien forms casting long shadows across the floor. Kian's heart raced, but he didn't move. His mind raced faster than his pulse. He was calculating, analyzing, looking for a way out, but there was no time. He knew they were outnumbered. The invaders' suits were impenetrable, their weapons deadly. It was a miracle they'd even gotten this far. But they had no choice. They couldn't let the invaders take back the information they had uncovered. This map was their ticket to fighting back, to tracking the invaders' next moves and staying one step ahead. "We're surrounded," Arya said, her voice low but steady, her hand tightening around her weapon. Kian's grip on his own weapon tightened as he slowly took a step back, guiding his team behind him. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. If they fought here, they would risk losing everything they had worked for. If they ran, they'd never make it out alive. There was no safe choice. "Stay calm," Kian muttered, his mind working quickly. He could see the invaders moving closer, their weapons glinting in the dim light. They didn't seem to be in any rush. They knew they had them trapped. They were playing with their prey. "I'm not going to let them have the map," Kian said, his voice filled with resolve. He glanced at Layla and Jackson, who had been silently observing the situation, waiting for a sign. "Layla, Jackson, you're with me. We make our move when I say." Layla nodded, her eyes narrow with determination. Jackson, ever the engineer, was already calculating their odds, his mind undoubtedly running through every possible scenario. The invaders took another step forward, and that's when Kian made his move. Now, the sound of weapons being drawn echoed through the room, but Kian was already in motion. He sprinted forward, ducking low to avoid the incoming fire from the invaders. Layla followed immediately, covering his back with rapid, precise shots that struck the first invader in the chest. She didn't hesitate, moving fluidly and without mercy. Kian reached the console that projected the map and slammed his fist down on it. The map flickered and the projection distorted, cutting off the data feed. At the same moment, Jackson deployed a small device, an EMP grenade, setting it off in the corner of the room. The device sent a shockwave of energy through the building, short-circuiting the power grid. The lights flickered, and the hum of the machine sputtered before going completely silent. In the darkness, chaos erupted. The invaders were temporarily blinded, their vision systems scrambling to adjust. Kian didn't wait for them to recover. He moved with precision, taking down one of the invaders in close combat, disarming him before using the alien's own weapon against the next in line. It was quick, too quick for the invaders to react. But there were still more of them, and as Kian spun around to face the remaining enemies, he realized something. They weren't just fighters. They were hunters. The invaders had been bred for this. They were trained to survive, to destroy. And they wouldn't let a few humans stop them. "Move," Arya shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos as she grabbed Kian's arm and pulled him toward the back of the room. She was right. Staying here would only result in death. They needed to escape, and they needed to do it fast. The group fought their way to the back door, moving as a unit. Layla's sharp eyes scanned the room, identifying every possible route of escape. Jackson used his tech skills to hack into the facility's security system, opening the door just in time for them to slip through. The door slammed shut behind them with a metallic clang, but the invaders weren't far behind. Kian's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They were outnumbered, and their chances of survival were slim if they stayed on the defensive. "We need a way out now," Kian said, urging his team to move faster. The outpost was still a maze of corridors and rooms, and they had no idea which direction led to safety. The building was crawling with invaders, and with each passing moment, the walls seemed to close in on them. "We need to head toward the surface," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the situation. "There's a maintenance tunnel in the next hall. We can use it to get to the surface level. It should be our best shot." Kian nodded. He didn't need to be told twice. The tunnels were their best option. They would be able to avoid direct confrontation and get out of the facility before the invaders could regroup. But as they rounded the corner, they came face to face with a new threat. A squad of invaders blocked the exit. Their armor gleamed in the dim light, their weapons aimed directly at the survivors. Kian cursed under his breath. There was no way around them. They were trapped again. He had only seconds to make a decision. "Get ready," Kian ordered, his voice cold with determination. He glanced at Arya, Layla, and Jackson. "We fight our way out. We push through. Do whatever it takes." Before they could react, the invaders opened fire. Kian and his team dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the deadly shots. The air was thick with tension as the survivors returned fire, their weapons clashing against the invaders' shields. The sound of the battle echoed down the narrow hallways, and Kian could feel the heat of the conflict closing in on them. They fought with everything they had. Leela's sharp shooting, Jackson's tactical mind, Arya's battle experience, and Kian's raw determination. It wasn't enough, though. The invaders had superior weapons and armor. But that didn't matter to Kian. He wasn't going to let them win. Not after everything they had already lost. With a final push, Kian managed to break through the line of invaders, his heart pounding in his chest. Arya followed closely behind, and the rest of the team quickly followed suit. They had broken free, but only just. The invaders were close, too close for comfort. They ran, their feet pounding against the cold concrete floor, heading toward the maintenance tunnel Jackson had mentioned. Kian didn't dare look back. He knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they were safe. The tunnel loomed ahead, a faint light flickering at its entrance. The survivors were almost there, but before they could make it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. They weren't alone. The invaders were right on their tail. Kian didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. They had come too far to turn back now. With one final push, the survivors reached the tunnel entrance and slipped inside, the door slamming shut behind them just as the invaders reached the threshold. For a moment, there was silence. They had escaped. For now. But Kian knew this was only temporary. The invaders would come after them. They always did. And next time, they might not be so lucky. They had learned something crucial. The invaders weren't just here to conquer Earth. They were here to erase humanity. Completely. And Kian had only one thought in his mind now. They couldn't let that happen.